Hello, sociology students. So, today we're going to be going over the review for exam 2. Make sure you have something that you can take notes with. I'm going to go through the main things that you need to make sure that you focus in on the readings for the upcoming exam this upcoming weekend. So, all right, I'm just because this is a review, I'm going to be jumping around different topics. It's not going to necessarily flow like a lecture. All right, so we're going to start with the racial prerequisite cases and the Lopez readings. And so while whiteness was never legally defined, remember in the readings, whiteness was always defined by the courts through saying who was not white, but they never said definitively what whiteness meant, legally speaking. Blackness, however, was defined by Congress in 1870 as any person with any amount of African ancestry, otherwise known as the one drop rule. All right. Regardless of what the person looks like, regardless of anything. If you have one drop of African ancestry, you're considered black by Congress in 1870. Now, there were 52 racial prerequisite cases altogether that ended up defining legally the white-black distinction racially in America. Now, make sure that you watch the Slavery and the Making of America documentary, and you'll notice that the major social institution that was built in America through stolen labor via the institution of slavery is the economy. Uh, Now, in 1922, we have the case of Ozawa, who argued before the U.S. Supreme Court that he should be considered white because he was culturally white, his children only spoke English, and he had a lighter skin tone. Those were all of his reasons. And so, keep in mind, though, also what he's focusing on for his arguments in trying to determine or trying to make the argument that he should be considered white in 1922. However, the Thin case now in 1923 mainly revolved around the question of whether Caucasian also meant white or if those were two separate categories. And for those of you who have kept up with the readings, you'll notice a kind of theme throughout Lopez's dealing with the racial prerequisite cases is that a lot of the decisions and the things that the reasonings that judges used just seem absolutely absurd today, and yet they end up serving as the foundation for how we have legally defined and dealt with race in this country. So, the group who was placed in concentration camps in the U.S. during World War II because their loyalty to the U.S. was in question was not German Americans, but Japanese Americans. And so again, because they were Japanese Americans and German Americans by that point in time been considered white. Now, if you go back to the 1700s, Germans were not considered white. Um, by World War II, they were, though. And so you see Japanese Americans' loyalty being questioned, but nobody ever raised the question of whether German Americans could be trusted in America. They were white, so they were just assumed to be trustworthy and loyal. All right. Now, we see that in the 20th century, there was a turn away from using science because science can't define race. Race does not exist scientifically. There's too much variability in terms of how humans look on the surface to really break us up into clearly defined races the way that we have in the modern age. There's too much ambiguity. There's too many exceptions. the whole concept of race in the modern sense does not make sense from a scientific perspective. And so, because science was saying in the 20th century, race effectively does not exist except for within the social realm, it has social consequences, but it does not have any kind of biological legitimacy. Then the courts ended up using what they defined as common sense definitions of race, which, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, common sense definitions of race then mean the cultural biases of the day, whatever they may be, depending on the time period you're looking at. So the courts in the 20th century decided that white as a racial category did not mean the same thing as Caucasian, that they meant separate things. So, moving on. While Syrians, we see also with these prerequisite cases that the judges who are deciding the cases go back and forth. And so, while Syrians were considered non white in 1913 and 1914, they were considered white in court cases from 1909, 1910, and 1915. So, that again just illustrates just how subjective these decisions were. And there was no real rhyme or reason or logic or science at all behind any of this. So, between 1878 and 1909, um, every prerequisite case denied whiteness except one. There was one exception in this time period. It was the case of Henry Rodriguez. Henry Rodriguez. We see G. Hop is important to know his case because he had his his citizenship was revoked just because he went and visited China in 1895, and he was not allowed to re-enter the U.S. even though he was a citizen of the U.S. Um, the racial prerequisite cases really come about after the end of Reconstruction. And this is not surprising because it was once Reconstruction ended, Jim Crow segregation and legal segregation ended up just sweeping in. And without Reconstruction, institutions and the U.S. military to ensure racial parity of some sort, then we ended up seeing a reversion back to how things were organized before the Civil War in the South, only under different labels, under different names. Well, here's the problem, though, is that during that time period, there you end up seeing what was called the wave or the second wave of immigration or the new immigrants. And so the new immigrants were oftentimes people who seemed racially ambiguous to white Americans, who were mainly from English stock, and so Anglo Americans. Um, and what we end up seeing is that from 1878 to 1952, these were the periods of time where the racial prerequisite cases were being decided because this was the time period in which Jim Crow segregation was established and carried out with all of its consequences. Now, in 1952, Congress decided that no one could be denied citizenship based on race, sex, or marital status. And so, if you wanted to deny someone's citizenship based on race, sex, or marital status, you had to come up with other ways of defining it. The Nationality Act of 1940 granted birthright citizenship to all racial minorities. And so all racial minorities were not considered naturalized citizens, even if they had been born in the United States until 1940. Congress did not grant citizenship to Native Americans until 1924. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, you heard that right, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 invalidated the Dred Scott decision and decided everyone except Native Americans who were born in the U.S. were citizens. And so, even in this invalidating the Dred Scott decision, the legislation still made an exception for Native Americans. Now, during the 19th and much of the 20th century, citizenship was banned in the U.S. for Indians, Chinese, and Native Americans during the entire 19th century and a good chunk of the 20th century. Now, excuse me for using this language. I feel uncomfortable using it myself, but this is what the government, the language the government used, the U.S. government. And so in the 1950s, Attorney General Herbert Brownwell launched Operation Wetback. And many Mexicans and Mexican Americans were forcibly deported during this time period in the 1950s. 1 million people were deported in 1954 alone, just in that 1 year. And this program lasted until the 1960s. Now, the National Origin Act of 1924 limited immigration from areas other than Northern and Western Europe. It actually set up racial quota systems. That was later replaced by immigration reform in the 1960s. But even then, preferential treatment was given to Europeans. Now, during the Great Depression, we see Mexican Americans became a ready-made scapegoat. And so this is 1930s, the operation I was just talking about that the government ran that deported so many people, that was the 1950s. In the 1930s, you end up seeing Mexican Americans being blamed for the Depression, for the whole "they take our jobs" myth. And then 500,000 people, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were deported or exiled from the U.S. From 1790 to 1952, all right, so less than 100 years ago, citizens were defined as people who are either considered white, so you had to be white to be considered a citizen. You had to be living in the country for at least 2 years, and you had to be living according to Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. So, or excuse me, that you had to fit the definition of citizenship in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, I meant. In 1917, the Asiatic Barred Zone was passed, deciding that all people born on the continent of Asia were denied immigration into the U.S. That was 1917. The 1882 Act that barred Chinese laborers from citizenship and that later expanded to bar all Chinese immigration to the United States by 1884 was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it was 1882, barred Chinese laborers from citizenship. By 1884, it barred all Chinese immigration. And remember that many of the Chinese laborers were brought in to complete the Transcontinental Railroad across the continental United States. The 1857 Supreme Court decision that directly denied citizenship and thus rights to African Americans, regardless of being free or enslaved, was the Dred Scott decision. And so this is a very important decision that sets the legal tone, or the judicial tone, I should say, in terms of respecting rights of minorities. According to Lopez, law is used to define who has rights to a sense of identity and what identities you have a right to, what privileges you have under the law in terms of rights, and your ability to own property. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, U.S. courts ended up defining whiteness, as I've already said it, through negation by who was not white. And according to Lopez, while white people do not see themselves in terms of race and thus are often unaware of privilege that comes with whiteness, Barbara Flagg has called this effect the transparency phenomenon. So that's Barbara Flagg, who calls the inability to see one's own racial privilege as a transparency phenomenon. Now, Lopez cites that white American women who were married someone who was not white were stripped of their citizenship up until 1931. So, if you were a white woman and you married someone who was defined as not white, then suddenly you became not white and you lost your citizenship. Now, this was at the intersection of race, sex, and gender. And we see that marriage, the principle of coverture, was being used. And so, coverture, or to cover something, to cover over something, uh, is where the husband's identity covers the wife's identity as well. And so that's why you'll still see it today in terms of how people will write something out. So they might put like Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, right? Well, then John Smith's identity stands in for his wife's identity. All right. So, in that sense, then John Smith, if John Smith were a racial minority, then John Smith's racial identity and thus his lack of citizenship before 1931 would have covered the wife as well, even if the wife had previously been defined as white. Race has historically in the United States been defined in different periods in different ways. It's been defined in terms of national origin. It's been defined in terms of popular opinion. It's been defined according to language and language usage. All of these are different ways that people have tried historically to define race. And again, none of them actually work in the way that the modern conception of race. Now, in US v. Thind, and remember I mentioned Thind just a moment ago, in 1923, the US Supreme Court solidly shifted to common knowledge definitions of race to deny citizenship to Indian immigrants. In Ozawa v. US in 1922, which I've already mentioned as well, the US Supreme Court decided that Japanese immigrants could be denied citizenship, citing both common knowledge and science for why Japanese people were not considered white. Again, we with science, more pseudoscience, not real science, not science as we know it today. In 1922 and again in 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court defined race in terms of common knowledge. Racial categories are difficult to define, and they are not real. They are not based in biology, and they are not proven in science. Actually, science doesn't prove anything. It lends evidence to things. It doesn't prove something. It's kind of like this. Think of it like this. For those of you who've never studied the philosophy of science, scientific analysis, or scientific methodologies hinge on systematic observation. By systematic observation, we can say that there are no pink elephants. That's, however, cannot be understood as an absolute statement because we've never gone out and tagged every single elephant that exists on the entire planet. And even if we did, there's always the possibility that there's a pink elephant out there somewhere that we missed. So, in that sense, we would say that systematic observation tells us that or lends evidence to suggest that there's no such thing as a pink elephant. But that doesn't mean that science has proven there are no pink elephants. I hope that makes sense. I almost asked my camera, does that make sense? Like I'm expecting my computer to respond to me. Oh, wow, I've been quarantined for too long, I think. All right. The 1878 case that denied U.S. citizenship to Chinese immigrants for not being white, Henry Yup. The German scholar who lived from 1752 to 1840, who created basic racial categories that are still being used today, was Johann Blumenbach. Johann Blumenbach. And keep in mind, he expanded Carl Linnaeus's model from 4 racial categories to 5. U.S. citizenship was legally defined as open only to white persons from 1790 to 1952. So citizenship in the United States was only for white people from 1790 to 1952, the vast majority of American history. According to Lopez, racial prerequisite cases illustrate that race is a social construct, that race as we think about it today was defined historically by institutions such as the judicial system. And they illustrate that having a clear legal definition of whiteness was considered incredibly important for deciding what groups were granted rights and what groups were not. And so, again, it illustrates the importance of whiteness in terms of granting rights. And so, at this point, this is when white privilege was being codified within the legal system. And as we can see, like for instance, housing segregation is no longer legal based on race. But we see it still happens all the time. And so something doesn't have to, it's the difference between de jure and de facto realities, right? De facto is what in point of fact is happening. De jure is what's happening according to law or the legal system says should be happening. And oftentimes, what's actually occurring in a given society does not necessarily match up with what the law says should be happening in a given society. So we can see the same is true in terms of privilege, that it was codified, it was institutionalized from 1790 to 1952, and it's been continued through informal measures since. So, and sometimes formal still. All right. So, while no one alive today had a hand in establishing our current racial system, and this is important because you hear people say all the time, oh, well, I wasn't around during the Civil War, I wasn't around during this time or that time. I've only been on this planet for so many years. So, yeah, of course, no one alive today had a hand in establishing our current racial systems. Of course not. But each new generation invests in the racial systems inherited from past generations. And so it's this reinvestment in the racial systems that continue it being perpetuated across generations and perpetuates inequality. The Supreme Court case that declared the death penalty illegal in 1972 is actually declared unconstitutional for a period of 5 years. between 1972 and 1977. Um, and it was because the Supreme Court decided that there was considerable, overwhelming evidence for racial bias in terms of who was getting the death penalty. And that landmark decision was Furman v. Georgia. Furman v. Georgia. Now, Charles Lawrence talks about unconscious racism. So, an example of unconscious racism, it would be when a judge who does not think that she's racist consistently gives harsher punishments to African Americans than European Americans and doesn't even realize that she's doing it. And so that would be an example of unconscious racism. That people are engaging in prejudicial behavior in an institutional setting that perpetuates inequality from the past, and they're doing it just because they're practicing their culture and not even thinking about what they're doing, and they're not going back and doing a systemic analysis of their past behaviors to see where, well, actually this white person was brought in for burglary and this black person was brought in for burglary, and I gave the white person probation, and neither of them had prior criminal histories, but I gave the black person 20 years. Um, Now, if you go back and do a systemic analysis of your past decisions and you find these glaring disparities like that, then you might want to do some soul searching. You might want to go and take Harvard's implicit association test. So, keep in mind, law is not consistent or monolithic. There's this people who talk about this is a nation of laws. Yes, it is a nation of laws. It's a nation governed by the law. No, there is no the law. Laws are not consistent, they're not monolithic, and you can oftentimes find contradictions in our legal systems. You can find contradictions between city, state, and national levels. You can find contradictions within ordinances, policies, and legislations passed presently and compared to legislation that's still in the books in the past, and you'll find contradictions. And so that's why when you hear of somebody who, quote unquote, gets off on a technicality, the technicality is oftentimes the fact that the law is not consistent and there are contradictions. So, passing a law does not automatically change society. Oftentimes people think that if a law gets passed, that society that's been doing something for however many generations is just going to automatically change. That's not how society and culture works. And especially if the law is not enforced, if it's just sitting on the books and not being enforced, people aren't going to follow it. People aren't going to change. We are creatures of pattern, and we do not like change. Even if changing is for the better, we would rather. Oftentimes, humans would rather put up with an almost intolerable situation rather than tolerate change to achieve something better. Law and society, or law and culture, however you want to look at this, influence each other in a reciprocal relationship. So it's not that law dictates the society or society dictates law. It's constant back and forth going on between the two. All right. Now, another reason that the racial prerequisite cases have a continuing impact on the legal system in the US is because we rely a lot, because we've inherited our legal system from British common law. And so a lot of this is based on, a lot of decisions are based on precedents, historical precedents. And so the history in our legal system is always very much relevant. And if a law that was passed in 1795 was never struck down, then it's still relevant today in the 21st century. Even if that law might have no relevance to how our society works today in the 21st century. So, in this sense, law kind of works as a kind of ideology. And so that means that in the US, because we've established this symbolic meaning of racial categories that comes with built-in perspectives. And so race and the belief that race is a real thing that can be easily determined for every individual is one of those perspectives that's been passed down, even though legally you're not supposed to make any decisions based on race. So this is how law's ideology is how this stuff is perpetuated. The last racial prerequisite case was in 1952. Um, the reason why racial prerequisite cases continue to have legislative and judicial effects even today, even though there's this overall commitment to race neutrality by the U.S. government, there are two main reasons. They've fostered racial applications of law that are not on the surface about race, and they being legislators, judges, have fostered the belief that racial inequality is over. And when we see racial disparities within the legal systems, that they're passed off or dismissed as being exceptions when they're not exceptions. They're actually the pattern. Um, so all of the statements I'm about to say are all empirically true statements. In other words, these are all statements that are supported by empirical methodologies, systematic observation, or scientific methodology. So, poverty has been twice what it is for African Americans than for European Americans over the past 40 years. Actually, we need to expand that. It's now 60 years, for the past 60 years. Basically, when we started paying attention to these kinds of disparities and the data. Black men are 3 times more likely to be pulled over and searched by the police than white men are. White men with a criminal record are more likely to get a call back for jobs than black men without a criminal record. All of the statements I just made are the conclusions of social scientific studies. Now, Ruth Frankenberg argued that while white people are conscious of their racial identity, many hold to ideologies that deny that there is social privilege with being considered white. And so it's one of these strange kinds of things where people will, where European Americans will acknowledge, yes, racial minorities face discrimination. Well, if this of groups of people are facing discrimination and your group is not facing discrimination because of racial group membership, then your group is privileged. And so, while many European Americans will acknowledge that racial minorities are disadvantaged, they will not acknowledge that the flip side, which must be true. If racial minorities are disadvantaged, then that means a racial majority is advantaged. All right, so it's yeah. Now, historian David Rodinger argued that whiteness has no content because, unlike other racial categories, it was defined legally by and culturally by what it's not rather than what it is. And so, in this sense, whiteness doesn't have a distinct content in the same way that other racial categories are understood to have. Because whiteness becomes the universal subject. All right. Now, Lopez disagrees with these suggestions, but there are two main suggestions for where to go in the future, or where we could go in the future, that Lopez disagrees with. But he still presents their arguments, right? Because it's important to listen to people even that you don't agree with. And the first one is we could develop a clear definition of what is white, but he doesn't think that's a very promising way to go. It's more of a divisive way to go. Um, or we could get rid of the concept of race altogether. The problem is that if we suddenly get rid of the concept of race altogether, then how can you address social injustices that have built up over generations that are based on the concept of race? If you suddenly, wave your wand, bippity boppity boo, no race. Well, the effects of past racism are still going to be with us and still going to be in play. And so, all that does, if you get rid of the concept of race altogether, is deny us language that has been developed, that we've inherited, that has social impact, and to use to describe what's going on. Now, the racial prerequisite cases naturalize the concept of race, or they make race seem like it's natural, because it reaffirms the belief that they reaffirm the prerequisite cases, the belief that there are distinct races. They link character and cultural differences to racial identity, and they define race in an antagonistic way to one another. So to be this is to not be white. And so anytime you say to be this is to not be that, you are automatically setting up, in terms of identity, an antagonistic relationship. All right. According to Lopez, colorblind constitutionalism ends up creating double standards because you cannot address racial inequality if you refuse to look at the relevance of race in judicial cases. So, if you refuse to even examine how race impacts the cases, then you're doing constitutional colorblindness. Now, in Presley versus Etowah County Commission in 1992, the court ruled that no violation of the Voting Rights Act occurred in Alabama, even though changes in Alabama voting laws resulted in removing black representatives from the state government. So they passed rules that do not explicitly say anything about race. It suppresses minority votes, and then they get exactly what they want. Minority representatives in the state government lose their seats. And yet, the Supreme Court decided in 1992 that it was not a violation of the Voting Rights Act because the laws that were passed that suppressed minority votes did not explicitly say that was the goal of the laws. That was just a happy accident, according to the white legislators. All right. Now, in the Supreme Court case of Richmond v. J.A. Croson and Company in 1989, so it's Richmond v. J.A. Croson Company, 1989. The Supreme Court ruled against city programs directed at redressing or trying to fix racial inequalities and granting city contracts to businesses despite proven racial bias in which companies received city contracts. So again, just because something a law is on the books, I mean, we're talking about cases in '89 and '92. Just because certain laws are on the books, doesn't mean that the judges are necessarily going to uphold them, because law requires interpretation, and as long as there is interpretation that is allowed, then those laws can be interpreted as being non-racial, um, even though they have clear racial impacts. Now, according to Lopez, the category multiracial, when it was added to the census for the 2010 census, uh, illustrates the persistence of the idea of pure races. So, if someone is multiracial, then that means that they're a mix of races, right? Well, then that means that they're not a pure race. But that means then, by implication, that there is such a thing as pure races. It also continues the idea of such a thing as mixed races. Um, and it's the persistent of the idea that there is a correct racial categorization for everyone. Now, while the concept of race, the modern concept of race, was not invented until the 17th century, the naturalization of race makes it transhistorical. Or to put it another way, race is often projected into the past, and historical figures are classified by race, even when they were living in a time when the modern concept of race didn't exist. And so, this is one of the reasons why you see studies like looking at whether or not Egyptians are black, or are they Middle Eastern. Or, those concepts didn't exist back in ancient Egypt. Um, and there's an abundance of evidence, as you know from your readings, that even if we could bring an ancient Egyptian to the present and determine by our modern concept of race how we would classify them, we would most likely classify them as black. Now, in the 1960s, there was the famous study that was done called Black Like Me. And what happened is John Griffin um, ended up, I mean, I recommend reading the book. If you've never read Black Like Me, it's a classic. So, what he did is he ended up dyeing his skin. And so he didn't just do blackface, but he shaved his head, dyed his skin so that people would perceive him as black. And then he went out just to see how he got treated and to compare how he was treated when he was setting people up to perceive him as black versus when he was perceived as white. Now you say, okay, well, it was the 1960s. Surely, I mean, of course, I don't need to read the book to know he was treated horribly, right, when he was interpreted as black. However, Joshua Solomon was a student in Georgia who was identified as white, and he decided, after reading Black Like Me, that he was going to recreate this study in the current times. And so he did the same thing. This was in Georgia, and he said he had to stop the study and get a quote unquote what he called a dose of whiteness. In other words, he had to take the dye out of his skin, and he went back to having people see him as a white man. Um, and he only was able to last with people interpreting him as a black man for 2 days. 2 days. And he started having a mental breakdown. He couldn't take it. So, according to Lopez, for white people to reject whiteness, we would need to develop awareness of how race has social impacts. Recognize and accept consequences and responsibilities for stepping out of whiteness, and work daily to combat racial or white privilege. So, a common thing that you end up hearing people say is, well, why did poor whites fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War when poor whites didn't own slaves? I mean, the vast majority of white people in the South didn't own slaves, couldn't afford slaves, or enslaved people, I should say. And so, why would people who otherwise you might think at just a surface glance not benefit from a system of enslavement? Why would they fight to protect it? And the main reason, because the status provided by race was seen as a kind of compensation for class based inequalities. So, in other words, it was understood by poor whites at the time that because of economics and their economic class position, that they might not have it that great compared to rich white counterparts, but at least they had it better than black people. And so it was about racial status, or in other words, they fought for white privilege. All right. According to Lopez, while we will most likely to continue to use some kind of notion of race in the future, the conceptualizations, expressions, and categorizations of race are going to change dramatically. And so, while we'll probably still think of ourselves in this sense just because it's so embedded in Western culture at this point in history, the way we think about them, the categories, and who is or how people are thinking about themselves in terms of race and ethnicity is going to change dramatically as we go forward into the future. And we're seeing that right now in terms of the debate about whether or not someone can be transracial. And it's an interesting debate. I don't want to weigh in on it because it's it's complicated, and I still haven't figured out what exactly I think about in those terms. So I'm not going to offer a view when my view is not fully formed. um, so current racial dynamics in the U.S. are formed by social unacceptability of overtly white supremacist ideologies, or that was the case in the past at least. Um, you can tell this book is about 10 years old. I mainly assigned it for the history, the legal history in it, because you're seeing currently more acceptance of white supremacist ideologies in the mainstream. I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, but I am. But anyways, in talking about color blindness and how color blindness works, uh, in groups that are still practicing that, there's a general social unacceptability of overtly white supremacist ideologies. And also new demographics produced by immigration and intermarriage are changing racial dynamics. But keep in mind that even with interracial marriages, we see that the white black color line is still heavily policed, whereas other interracial marriages are more common. Now, also, when talking about majority and minority, that language in sociology, if we are discussing the numeric majority or numeric minority, we typically will say numeric majority, numeric minority. Um, but when we're just talking social majority and social minority, we're talking about social power. So, for example, for those of you who have taken the sociology of gender, you will have learned, or the sociology of sexuality, you will have learned that we live in a patriarchal culture, patriarchal society, or male dominated society. However, in the United States, there's actually numerically more women than men. And so, while there is masculine privilege, men are actually a numeric minority in America, but a social majority. And so, in that sense, it's a reference, majority minority is a reference not to numbers, but to power. So, in this sense, the prediction of the future of race in the US that predicts that whites will become the numeric minority but still retain the social majority is referred to as white exceptionalism. Black exceptionalism predicts that the future of race in America is that while other groups will be assimilated into whiteness, African Americans will be continue to be discriminated against. So that would be black exceptionalism. That while more and more groups, and as we saw with the racial prerequisite cases, more and more groups get included into this ever expanding definition of whiteness, but African Americans are constantly considered not white. And so black exceptionalism as a prediction for the future holds that even more people are going to become considered white, except for African Americans still. Now, the prediction of the future of race in America that predicts that race will come to be seen on a continuum rather than just either ors. So you're either in this category or that category. It's more of a spectrum of racial categories. And that's referred to as the Latin Americanization of race. That's how the concept of, or the modern concept of race works in many Latin American countries. Lopez has his own perspective, and he has his own prediction, and he argues that the racial future of the U.S. will be colorblind white dominance, where there will be still white privilege, but people will deny that there is any racial inequality anymore, and that more and more people will just subscribe to that ideology, regardless of the evidence to the contrary. Now, illustrating systemic racial bias, because one of the things that we know is that crime is diffuse across demographic groups. In other words, now someone who's poor versus someone who's rich, they're going to commit different crimes, but the rate of criminal activity is fairly diffuse. And that is not only true of economic categories, it's also true in terms of gendered and racial categories as well. And so the instance of breaking the law is about the same for European Americans as it is for African Americans. However, African Americans make up only about 13% of the total US population, but about 40% of the total prison population. And so, I mean, if we know that crime and criminal activity is diffuse across racial categories, then the disparity there is coming from who's getting caught, who's getting policed, who's getting punished, um, and who's getting away with it. Now, according to Lopez, law is what we call an ideal type in sociology, meaning it's an abstract process between multiple institutions categorized by the term law and not a real thing in any kind of material sense. So it's an idealization of the society you live in, not actually how the society you live in works. So the basic definitions of colorblind white dominance, according to Lopez, his prediction for the future, continued racial dominance by white people, an expansion of who is considered white, and a strengthening of colorblind ideologies and blocked attempts at redressing racial inequality in the name of racial equality. So get that, is blocking attempts to redress racial inequality and justifying it as a fight for racial equality. So that's what he predicts for the future. And we're seeing that. According to Lopez, statutory law refers to law passed by legislation, such as acts of Congress. According to Lopez, case law refers to laws established by court decisions, so judicial law. Now, one illustration of how case law affects social systems, such as the economy, or social institutions like the economy, is after Armenian immigrants were declared white in 1909, they became farmers and hired Japanese immigrants who were declared not white, many of whom learned to speak Armenian instead of English. So, what that ended up doing was giving an economic leg up to Armenians over Japanese immigrants based on this arbitrary decision that Armenians are white and Japanese are not. All right. Now, to illustrate the problem with precedents and the contradictions in law, Lopez cites convoluted case of the Mashpee tribe in Cape Cod when they sued to reclaim tribal lands. The case law involved in that example, that was drawn from in that example, included the 1976 decision that denied the Mashpee claim. So, the 1976 decision, the Indian Non-Intercourse Act of 1790, and the 1901 Supreme Court definition of what constituted a tribe. So basically, it decided they had no legal standing because they weren't really a tribe. Frederick Douglass once said, and this is an important quote: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." Now, the continental theory of race is the erroneous belief that races can be distinguished by geographic area and are distinct from one another. Now, we do see certain phenotypes grouping around different latitudes on the planet, but that doesn't mean that people of different latitudes, because that goes all the way around the planet, right? That people of different latitudes are all of one race. But we do see certain phenotypes grouping around, like such as in hotter climates, human skin producing more melanin, and in cooler climates, less melanin. But it's erroneous because there's not a distinction there. It's all appearance and nothing more. There's nothing deeper than that. Lopez argues that while there's been an emphasis on this idea of biorace, an attempt to justify biorace, and that attempt will continue to decline as more and more people understand what science has been saying since the 1950s, that there is no biological basis for modern racial categories. He argues that you're still going to see more and more emphasis being placed on social race, or race in terms of social groups that people are born into. All right, so let's turn to Van Sertima. Um, According to Van Sertima, many prominent Europeans, upon visiting Egypt in the 19th century, had their racial ideology justifying enslavement of Black people as being inferior deeply challenged. So they actually had kind of a crisis of faith, so to speak, in terms of their faith that Europeans' faith that people from the continent of Africa were somehow inferior, because typical ancient Egyptian depictions of themselves were with physical characteristics that would be called in modern times Black features. According to Van Sertima, the racial characteristics of ancient Egyptians has been a source of obsession among European and European American scholars since the 19th century, because those scholars refuse to accept that ancient Mediterranean cultures and knowledges that formed the foundation of European culture through Greece and Rome actually came from Black people. This was because the Greek philosophers, um, would go to Egypt to receive an education. A lot of the virtues that are discussed in Plato, for instance, is a watered down version of Egyptian virtues. He actually took several out. And so these Mediterranean cultures like Greece and Rome that are oftentimes held up as exemplars. Well, I mean, look at how the ancient Greeks in their own time treated their own philosophers. They were considered jokes. I mean, Aristophanes wrote The Clouds, making fun of Socrates, and his head's so far in the clouds he doesn't see where he's walking and he falls into a pit. I mean, hell, the city of Athens put Socrates to death um, because of his basically because he was teaching these foreign knowledges as they were considered at the time. And by foreign knowledges, they meant European knowledge, Egyptian knowledge. I'm sorry, Egyptian knowledge, not European. Um, According to Van Sertima, European Christians who enslaved other people did express feeling a moral issue and tried to reconcile slavery with Christianity. And they found their solution, their theological solution, in the curse of Ham. So Ham was cursed because he saw Noah naked. He was one of the sons of Noah, and the curse was that he would be a servant to the rest of his brothers for and their descendants for the rest of their existence. And so Europeans ended up interpreting the curse of Ham to be darker skin tones. That's what they interpreted it as and used to justify it. It's like, no, no, Noah said we could enslave you. According to Van Sertima, the original ancient name of Egypt was Kemi or Kemai, where who knows how it was actually pronounced. We're talking about a dead language now, which literally translates though as the Black Lands. According to Van Sertima, there is a great deal of archaeological evidence that much of Egyptian culture came from further south in the continent. And so the Egyptians were not necessarily the ones who were developing these knowledges themselves. And while the evidence is not definitive, there is evidence that suggests that a lot of the Egyptian culture and knowledge came from further south in the African continent, such as from Nubia. And from sub Saharan Africa, and from cultures that traded across the Sahara from Western Africa. And so Egypt was kind of a hub for where many African cultures ended up coalescing and collecting and having an influence. Now, also in the Van Sertima readings, ancient Greek historian Herodotus described, he went to Egypt during antiquity and he wrote about it. And he describes Egyptians, and this is a quote from Herodotus, a black-skinned and woolly-haired people. That's how he described them. According to Van Sertima, since Egypt existed before the modern concepts of race or nation states were created, after the unification of the upper and lower kingdoms, Lower Egypt became a kind of ethnic melting pot. Lower Egypt, it's not in reference to north and south, it's in reference to how the Nile flows. And the Nile flows into the Mediterranean. And so Lower Egypt is actually northern Egypt, and Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt. All right. So, in this sense, then, the part of Egypt that was closer to the Mediterranean, which, of course, the Mediterranean was a huge thoroughfare for trading goods and services and ideas, philosophy, religions. And so Lower Kingdom really became this hodgepodge of multiple cultural influences from all over the eastern hemisphere of the world. According to Van Sertima, anthropologist George Peter Murdoch used linguistic and archaeological data to find that plant domestication began in the Sudan and then spread to other areas outside of Africa. So, 10,000 years ago, there was this great domestication revolution, which was a major social revolution that ended up allowing for nomadic human groups to settle down and start farming. And it led to pastoral and horticultural societies. And so this is the domestication revolution. And it's oftentimes the story is presented as occurring in Mesopotamia originally. And so around the area of the Fertile Crescent, around where you would find like Iran in that area, or what was once Persia. However, and Iraq, what is today Iraq, but Mesopotamia in general, Babylon, Sumer, those areas. However, there's evidence to suggest the domestication revolution actually started long before Mesopotamia started doing it again, in the Sudan region of Africa. According to Van Sertima, Europeans had to invent new cultural groups that actually didn't exist. And this group that they invented was called the Hamitic culture in order to morally justify enslaving Africans. Now, Hamitic culture refers to Ham. And so calling it Hamitic culture is calling it the culture that descended from Ham, the son of Noah. So there is no such group, but they invented it. Much later, we end up seeing Aryan culture being created. Now, the Aryans didn't actually exist. There were proto-Viking groups coming out of Northern Europe, but they didn't call themselves Aryans. They were largely traders, except when the Vikings ended up taking over large swaths of England and France and so they sometimes conquered and colonized, but typically they were actually traders. All right. But again, Aryan culture is another example, but that was created later. Hamitic culture was created much earlier as a concept, I mean. Now, according to Van Sertima, in 1770 BCE, Lower Egypt, which would be northern Egypt, remember, was invaded by the Hyksos. There's an ancient group, the Hyksos, which were an Asiatic people and sent the more ethnically diverse Lower Egypt to seek refuge with the more African Upper Egypt. And so you end up seeing Lower Egypt losing to the Hyksos from Asia and then moving down into Upper Egypt. All right. According to Dunbar Ortiz. Now, I hope you all realize, understand why Van Sertima is important here. And it's because you oftentimes hear this in white supremacist ideology that all civilization and positive things in culture end up ultimately having their foundations in Europe. And you'll end up having academics even to this day making that kind of argument when the evidence doesn't support them. I mean, I've seen politicians making this argument, sitting behind a clock that has Arabic numerals in it, talking about chemistry, which was alchemia, or mathematics, algebra. It's coming from Arabic, and using with ticker take of words underneath them, written using the Phoenician alphabet. Uh, and so you just look around, and you see all of these other cultural contributions from all over the world surrounding this person, right in front of their face, and they're saying everything came from Europe, and they're surrounded by contributions coming from all over the world. It's just absurd. I mean, and what it is that people end up claiming, oh, no, 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 those things came from Europe too. No, they didn't. All right. And so that's why this is important. And so, and also, people, you cannot deny the influence of ancient Egypt on ancient cultures more generally. And so, what Europeans did instead, in the past, is they tried to make Egyptians white, which makes no sense. But again, to try to claim that the origins of culture are ultimately rooted in whiteness. Now, let's turn our attention to Dunbar Ortiz. In the Dunbar Ortiz readings, Edward H. Spicer argued that when Europeans began colonizing the Americas, they developed a culture of conquest. But as we'll see, that actually is not something that's generally accepted because the culture of conquest predates the colonization of the Americas. Um, According to Dunbar Ortiz, the European culture of conquest began long before colonization of the Americas and cites major examples, such as the Crusades during the medieval period of Europe. According to Dunbar Ortiz, Columbus's first voyage was launched in what year? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That question, if you get it, is intended to be a gimme. I have a few gimmies worked in here. According to Dunbar Ortiz, Europeans did not always view land as private property. But over the course of the late medieval and early Renaissance, closing common lands that were held commonly by people, and so aristocrats could use it, peasants could use it, serfs could use it, and they began using charges of witchcraft in order to take even more land and from the commons and turn it into privately held land. This ended up developing into the concept of private property that was then used to cheat Native American groups out of commonly held land because they didn't have a concept of owning land. That concept was very foreign to them during colonization. And so keep in mind, private property, the concept of private property in the scope of human history is actually relatively new. In the scope of human history, it's several hundred years old, but still, that's, when you're talking about a species, the modern form of which has been on the planet for 200,000 years, something that's just a few hundred years old is not that old. All right. According to Dunbar Ortiz, the color white has long held strong symbolic significance in European Christianity. And so whiteness is also considered pure, moral. And you see this in terms of how the cultural meanings that are assigned to colors. And so, like, red would be passion, right? Like red roses on Valentine's Day. Um, it also is associated with courage and valor. You see, you also see whiteness as being, as a color, culturally associated with purity and morality and goodness, and black with, in terms of color symbolism, as being evil and something to be avoided, something to be controlled, something that causes bad things to happen, like black cats, for instance, and that superstition. Um, all right. According to Dunbar Ortiz, though a relatively useless metal, Europeans in the 16th and 17th century were obsessed with finding gold and enslaved native populations and committed genocide in order to get it. Now, we say relatively useless. It was useless to Europeans in the 16th and 17th century, except it was shiny. Today, it's actually very useful and is used in a lot of high technology because gold is very conductive. Um, but Europeans in the 15, 1600s didn't have computers. So they weren't gold crazy because they needed to invent the microchip. Um, According to Dunbar Ortiz, the largest European ethnic group to colonize the eastern part of North America was actually the Scots Irish, who were largely not considered white until the 20th century. According to Dunbar Ortiz, Calvinist colonists into North America believed that their God had promised them North America, leading to the ideology that's been passed down in the U.S. of a covenant state, that it's a covenant with God. And so you had Europeans imagining themselves in this kind of Judeo Christian mythology as going through and conquering their promised land that was promised to them from God, and that was becomes this uh, justification for things like manifest destiny, the ideology of manifest destiny later. All right. According to Dunbar Ortiz, while the Seven Years' War between England and France was fought in the colonies as the French and Indian War, and so you probably heard it referred to as the French and Indian War. In Europe, they call it the Seven Years' War. It cemented in the minds of English colonists in North America the linking of being white with being a true patriot, because many Native Americans, though there were many Native Americans who fought on the British side, many more fought on the French side. And so this ended up being seen as being unpatriotic. But yet, Native Americans were denied citizenship, so it was kind of anyway. According to Dunbar Ortiz, from the time of the colonies up until the present, the pattern has been for European Americans to steal Native American sacred land and turn it into real estate, to commodify it, to turn it into something to sell, either for residential or commercial use. According to Harris in Whiteness as Property, being considered racially white is a kind of property because historically only whites were allowed to own property, concentrating private property ownership in white communities, and then that gets passed down through the generations. So again, that accumulation occurred in the past and then gets passed down. And so this is one of the reasons why we see so much more wealth in, on average speaking, um, in white communities rather than black communities. Not to say that there's not wealth in some black communities and that there's not a lot of poverty in some white community. Of course there is. Um, we're speaking about the broader pattern. Also, continuing with Harris as whiteness as property, it opens more opportunities to people, illustrated by the social phenomenon of passing. So, if somebody is would otherwise be considered a racial minority, but their skin tone is light enough that they can pass for white, they end up seeing a whole world of opportunities opening up to them that their parents didn't have. Um, it also grants privileges such as not being viewed as a threat by other white people. For instance, not having the police called on you for just living while black. According to Harris in Whiteness as Property, white privilege was legally codified in American case law. And so it's not just some wild idea that we sociologists have thunk up. White privilege was codified in case law. According to Harris, the Naturalization Act of 1790 opened up American citizenship to everyone who was white. So everyone who matched the description of white could now be a citizen, according to the Naturalization Act of 1790. Also, according to Harris, the denial of group membership into whiteness has led to racial subordination of minority groups. Harris goes on, the American institution of slavery is still relevant for contemporary times, for today, due to several reasons, of which are the amassing of wealth in white communities that then gets passed down through the generations. This is speaking collectively, because of course there are many white people who live in poverty. There's no denying that. That's obviously true, and no one is denying that. The status of whiteness that was established and passed down culturally, and the social networks that are passed down through the generations, granting or denying opportunities depending on perceived group membership. Also, according to Harris, whiteness acts as a kind of traditional property. So it's kind of like inheriting an estate from your ancestors. Well, whiteness has been in my family for generations. All right. Also, according to Harris, the notion of whiteness is still important to white people who otherwise get very little to no benefit economically from it, because it still acts as a status symbol, and acts as kind of a racialized class consciousness that allows poor whites to identify with wealthier whites instead of minority groups who are living in much more similar economic situations to them. And so you still see whiteness as the status symbol, even for white people living in poverty, because they do not see themselves as a part of the racial minorities that they may be living next to. They more identify with wealthier whites because they think that they buy into the ideology of meritocracy. As long as you have white skin and you do everything that rich white people tell you to do, that you too will be rich one day. And if that were the case, then why do you have so many people who are white who work their asses off their entire lives and then still die close to the poverty line? Obviously, that's an ideological belief, not an empirical fact. So, according to Harris again, property comes with expectations. In the case of whiteness, historically and currently, these have been seen as whiteness granting special rights. Anger and resentment arise when these expectations are not met. And so, if somebody goes into a situation and they expect certain privileges and they are not given those privileges, well, they don't see them as privileges, they see them as rights. And so they become angry and resentful, and they think that they're losing something when actually they might just be being treated like everyone else for the first time. Now, according to Harris, affirmative action cannot be understood as the parallel to white privilege. And there are many reasons why that doesn't work, because you'll hear people say things like, well, yeah, okay, there might be white privilege, but you have affirmative action. And so that counters the white privilege, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Excuse me. Affirmative action does not reverse the centuries of wealth accumulation in white communities. It just doesn't. It doesn't redistribute wealth at all. Affirmative action as a legal principle cannot reverse the ingrained tradition of white privilege. You can make it illegal, but that doesn't mean that people are not still practicing it. And it can become something that is very difficult to prove in a court case. We can show it using aggregate data, and show an overall pattern. But then when you start digging into the details, of course, you can start muddying the waters and lose sight of the forest for the trees, and miss the overall pattern, in other words. Also, while providing more opportunities to some people in minority groups, it has had little effect on structural inequality in America. And part of the reason for this is because affirmative action includes gender. And that's not a bad thing because women face discrimination in the workplace too, um, regardless of what race you are, just for being women. All you have to do is look at the number of Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. I think there might be three total, or look at the number of men versus women in the Supreme Court or the legislative bodies or anything of this sort. So, one of the things we see with affirmative action is that because it does include gender, is that a lot of benefits end up going to white women. And since we still largely practice uh, endogamy, marrying within our own group, and particularly in this sense, our own racial group, so white women tend to marry white men on average, if they're heterosexual. Um, well, then they're going to be bringing, if they get benefits from affirmative action, they're going to be bringing those benefits into white communities. All right. Also, according to Harris, white privilege is so deeply ingrained in American history and culture that many people who identify as white do not even realize the privilege they get because it has become so naturalized. And many end up assuming that the privilege that they get is just how people in general are treated, and oftentimes are honestly, authentically unaware of the privilege they're getting. All right, let's turn our attention to worth. I assigned worth for two main reasons. One, to illustrate the historical scope of anti Semitism in Europe, and as it also translated into the United States, um, or what would become later the United States. But also to show the historical origins of this concept of the ghetto and what the ghetto was intended to be, how the ghetto functioned in the past, because in many ways it functions the same way today. And so worth is really important just for the historical perspective. The origin of the ghetto, according to Worth, was a Jewish residential area in ancient Rome. That's how far back the ghetto goes, where they were secluded into their own neighborhoods. Now, according to Worth, the birth of modern ghettos was in Italy. Ghetto is actually Italian. And it started in the 15th century, the 1400s. Ghettos were originally Jewish enclaves that were voluntary to live in, originally. Medieval Christians pressured uh, medieval Christian pressures and the lack of prohibition against usury in Judaism or collecting interest on a loan. Usury used to be banned in Christianity as immoral, but it was not banned in Judaism. So as capitalism developed in medieval Europe, late medieval Europe, and into the Renaissance, these new economic systems, capitalisms, were developing, and they required loans for a period of time that would then be paid back. But Christian morality meant that if you loan somebody $2,000, once they've paid you back $2,000, then you're done with the transaction. And so, if you're not going to gain from investment, there's no incentive to invest. Whereas capitalism requires investment and thus requires interest rates, so you see returns on investment. And so, because Judaism did not have a prohibition, a moral prohibition against charging interest on loan or usury, many were actually forced into financial sectors and into merchanting, um, where they ended up developing some of them developed wealth, and that ended up leading to all of these anti-Semitic stereotypes of greedy Jews and things like along those lines. Um, I mean, hell, talk about self-fulfilling prophecy. All right. Over the centuries leading up to the 15th century, so leading up to the 1400s, Christian clergy commonly expressed fear that Jews would somehow corrupt Christians. So Jews were understood as a corrupting force. The logic used to justify anti Semitism is contradictory. The logic doesn't make any sense because there's no logic to it. And what that tells you is when you have an ideology that has no logic to it whatsoever, it tells you it's based in fear. It's coming out of fear. Um, we have that today. Look at the ideology, the conspiracy theories. I mean, it's really a set of conspiracy theories put together into an ideology that is very illogical. It's not based on any kind of solid empirical evidence like QAnon today. It's the same kind of thing as when you see an ideology that's an extensive ideology, but nonetheless is filled with logical gaps and holes and contradictions, then that is a sign that that ideology is coming out of fear. And so at that point, then what is the actual fear? In this case, it was the fear that there were people living in Christian Europe who were not Christian. By the 16th century, so by the 1500s, ghettos were often walled off from Christian neighbors. They were compulsory for Jews to live in, and they were locked at night to keep Jews in at night. So they became, by the 1500s, they were like mini concentration camps already, starting in Europe. The Roman ghetto, established in Rome, established by Pope Paul IV in 1556, became a model for ghettos across all of Europe, across the entire continent. Jews were often expelled from ghettos over fears of disloyalty during times of war. And so there was this sense that, or this fear by Christian Europeans that Jewish Europeans would not be loyal. And so they were oftentimes exiled out of those fears. And so if you were exiled, you would lose everything. You'd lose your social networks, you'd lose contact with financial resources, any other kind of resources. I mean, exile was no laughing matter. It was no joke. It had very serious consequences um, during this time period. Despite oppressive conditions, Jews living inside ghettos kept alive rich cultural traditions that are still being practiced to this day. They developed strong internal social solidarity, a strong sense of identity. And they would oftentimes visit other ghettos, and thus were Jews during this time period were typically more worldly, more traveled than their Christian counterparts, and oftentimes understood more about how the world worked in general than their Christian counterparts because of the travel. Right. All right, let's turn our attention to James Lowen and Lies My Teacher Told Me. Um, so, according to Lowen, American high school textbooks are factually wrong, biased in terms of race and class, and are actually more propaganda than history. According to Lowen, figures from America's past are often presented in idealistic terms that strips them of their humanity and turns them into godlike cultural heroes. The first organized large-scale revolt of enslaved people happened in 1519 in Haiti. The Spanish token and encomienda, encomienda, encomienda systems. So the Spanish token and encomienda systems were both ways to force labor from Native Americans. Woodrow Wilson tried to block women's right to vote, even though he gets credit for women getting the right to vote. He actually tried to block it. Racially segregated the federal government, and he removed civil rights from those with whom he disagreed. So if he disagreed with you politically, you might get locked up. That was Woodrow Wilson. So that kind of behavior is not necessarily new to America. Most of the colonists on the Mayflower, according to their own testaments and testimonies, crossed the Atlantic not for religious reasons, but seeking wealth. And it's more of a propaganda to teach that they were seeking religious freedom. They were seeking economic opportunities. The theft and concentration of wealth from the Americas and Africa and European nations are some of the major reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe before anywhere else. And even that, if not, I mean, if you define the Industrial Revolution in terms solely of using fuels for machines instead of animal labor, for instance, then yes. But you ended up having in antiquity a lot of developments towards industrialization. Like the ancient Romans had a factory system of sorts, complete with its own kind of assembly line. Of course, they didn't have electricity, and these kinds of things. But you see like pockets and areas. You see in China, you see it in parts of Africa, where there are moves in that direction towards mass manufacturing. But the Industrial Revolution occurs in England, actually, specifically. The first Thanksgiving, according to Lowen, is an American myth, as the Pilgrims built Plymouth on top of Squanto's village of Patuxet, Patuxet, whose inhabitants all died off suddenly. So Squanto was actually traveling abroad. Squanto had been to Europe. Squanto was not new to Europeans. And then he was very well traveled and highly educated. Came back after traveling abroad to return home to his home village. And what he found in the place of his village and the farms and the everything that had been built up for generations by his people were these pilgrims as Plymouth Rock. So, I mean, imagine you go on vacation, you come back, and you find entirely new people other than your family living in your home. And they say, no, no, this is mine now. That's kind of what happened to Squanto. Um, and Squanto was asking him, what happened to my people? And the pilgrims were like, oh, I don't know. They left. They all died suddenly. It was poof, gone. Who knows? All right. Continuing with Lowen, there are many myths that are taught as facts surrounding Christopher Columbus. Some of the myths, there are many of them, some of them, that most Europeans thought the world was flat at the time. Not true. Most Europeans, even uneducated Europeans, knew that the world was round. And Christopher Columbus did not think the world was round. Christopher Columbus thought it was egg-shaped. He thought it was an oval. That Columbus was the first European to go to the Americas. That's another myth. There's plenty of records of Europeans in America long before Columbus, dating back hundreds of years before Columbus. That Columbus's crew of sailors almost mutinied on the first village or in the first voyage because they were afraid of falling off the edge of the world. Not true at all. Again, that's a myth. According to Lowen, Jamestown is not given as much importance in American history due to the taboo of cannibalism. The Pilgrims, however, commonly robbed the graves and homes of Native Americans looking for riches. But Jamestown oftentimes is not talked about as much as the Pilgrims are, even though Jamestown predates Plymouth Rock, because the Jamestown settlers, in order to survive, started eating people. And it's settlers. They're not that word doesn't even make sense in this context. Like, they were invaders. They were colonists, but they weren't settlers. The area had already been settled or domesticated by humans. All right, let's turn our attention for a little bit to Kimmel. According to Kimmel, the explosion of mass violence in the US is coming mainly from white men who are angry about perceived declines in their social privilege. Most, not all, most mass shootings are from angry white men. So, according to Kimmel, part of the source of the anger for some white men is changing American definitions of masculinity. European American men have lost something, but they have lost things, but they have not lost things to women or to men of color. All Americans are seeing are for European American men and across the board are all Americans are seeing this lower educational standards, and they get lowered every year. It's really hard to keep up educational standards when educational standards are not being kept up in primary schools. All Americans are seeing a decrease in well-paying jobs and frozen wage values. Actually, they got frozen at 1970s level, and they're still at 1970s level, even though inflation has continued to go and continue to rise over the last 50 years. Um, and this was due to decades of American economic restructuring, starting largely in the 80s. Well, really, it started with Nixon in the early 70s, but it really revved up in the 80s, I should say. And all Americans are dealing with increasing levels of debt. And so this is not something where you can scapegoat a group over. It's all Americans are facing this. It's not this group or that group's fault. It's not, this racial group's fault or this gendered group's fault or this immigrant group's fault. Actually, all you have to do is that old saying, follow the money. Um, where's the money going? Well, we used to have people who had hundreds of thousands of dollars, like 100 years ago, and they would be considered incredibly wealthy. And then you had to be a millionaire, and then a multimillionaire, then a billionaire. We're going to see in our own lifetimes the rise of trillionaires if the pattern holds. And so all that value, all that wealth that's being generated by the economy collectively, it is going somewhere. It's just not going to the people who, get paychecks. All right. According to Kimmel, white male anger in the US has been channeled politically into ideologies of nativism and fears of immigrants who are not seen as white. So, nativism is America first, USA, USA. Screw anyone who's America, love it or leave it. These are the kind of slogans, the things that you hear that's associated with nativism. According to Kimmel, white male anger in the U.S. has fueled the resurgence in white supremacist, fascistic, and neo-Nazi groups. These are all groups that were dying out after World War II. They were not considered, their ideologies were not considered fit for polite society. You did not discuss these kinds of things even if you had sympathies for those ideologies. It was simply not discussed. Um, And so we see that these groups are becoming more and more mainstream. Something that I mean, we fought World War II to stamp out these ideologies, right? Well, as Oliver Stone showed, that wasn't really the reason we fought World War II. Anyway, according to Kimmel, white male anger is also fueled by the inability due to economic restructuring to use older models to define masculinity, such as the self made man. And so it's harder and harder because there's just less economic opportunities. Economic class is much more rigid and concrete than the dominant ideologies of America would have it. According to Kimmel, illustrating the complexity of the issue of most domestic terrorist groups and other white supremacist groups, is that there is a great deal of ideological diversity between the groups. They don't all subscribe to the exact same ideologies. There's a lot of diversity. There's loose notions of macho masculinity and white supremacy. These are things that all the groups do have in common, though. And so when you get into the details of the ideology, there's diversity, but they all subscribe to this macho masculinity and white supremacy. And the different groups emphasize different scapegoats. And so they have different groups that they focus on as being the problem group. According to Kimmel, the mythical figure that never actually existed in history, that angry white male groups tend to look at as a positive example, is the myth of the caveman. So, that's what's driving this paleo diet that doesn't even follow what people would have been eating in the Paleolithic period. Anyway, all right. According to Kimmel, more attention needs to be paid to how boys are being raised in the U.S. due to hypermasculine messaging. Racial and gender segregation and bullying all leads to psychological trauma that later gets expressed as anger. So this anger, it's not to dismiss the people who are angry because they're suffering. I mean, have you ever been just furious at something? I mean, that's not a positive feeling. That's not a good way. If you're feeling that every day, that's got to be coming from some kind of trauma. According to Kimmel, anger, whiteness, and hypermasculinity are directing and framing American politics. And he wrote this back in 2008 originally. All right. Now, I'm turning to the questions that you may come across coming out of Lowen's collection of primary sources, the Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader. And so that's what these questions are coming from, is out of those readings. In every declaration of war and secession from the Confederate States, the main thing that was listed in all of them as the primary motivation for the Civil War, according to the Confederate States themselves, to keep gaining the economic benefit from the enslavement and trade of black people. Every declaration of war and secession said the exact same thing in that regard. So people want to say, oh, it's about states' rights, oh, it's about this. Listen to what the people themselves said it was about. They said they were declaring war to protect the institution of slavery. They didn't mince words about it. There's no interpretation. It's not open to that. You have the things for yourself. If you've not looked through them, it's right there. You can look it up yourself. Now, according to Samuel A. Cartwright, who was considered a major figure in American medical sciences, he came up with the disease that made enslaved people want to run away, and he called it drapetomania. You heard me right. He invented a disease. So if you were an enslaved person and you wanted to escape slavery, you were now considered, according to Samuel A. Cartwright, to be mentally ill. All right. It's one of those things. You can't make this shit up. It's just too crazy. All right. Ideologically, the Confederacy was organized around the principle of white supremacy, according to the wealth of primary source materials that I provided for you. They were all very clear. All of the materials were saying that it was to protect white culture, white privilege, white supremacy. Again, there's no avoiding it. It's in the historical documents themselves. By 1964, the party of Lincoln, the Grand Old Party, the GOP, Republican Party, had become tied to neo-Confederate ideology as demonstrated through the use of the Southern strategy to win Southern white votes. All right. There's going to be more on that later. Lopez wrote the book called Dog Whistle Politics, where he goes into more detail on that and the Southern strategy and how that worked. The persistence of Confederate ideology into the 21st century can be demonstrated by the continuing existence of the Ku Klux Klan, American politicians celebrating and memorializing people who fought to keep other people enslaved, basically, so traitors to the United States. The Confederacy, in breaking off from the United States, was declaring war against the United States. And so, I mean, we typically look down on people who kill American soldiers, right? Well, Confederate soldiers were killing American soldiers. All right. Also, the persisting conspiracy theories about racial and ethnic minority groups and Northern liberals trying to dominate white Southerners. And actually, when you look at the distribution, how much taxes are paid in nationally versus how much public resources are used. Most southern states, not all, most, actually pay far less in terms of taxes to the national government than the amount of resources that they take out. So where are those resources coming from? Largely, they're coming from the West and the Northeast. And so rather than being dominated by Northern liberals, as these conspiracy theorists will have it, shortfalls in Southern economies are actually met with a lot of Northern tax dollars. So, something to keep in mind. Basically, since Reconstruction, most of the South's economy has been on a type of collective welfare. All right, now we're going to turn our attention to Jimenez. As you all know, Jimenez has multiple readings. She's the editor, not the writer, though she contributes some pieces to the book herself. The piece contributed to the book by Iris Rodriguez was what? What was it? I'm not going to tell you. Go look it up. Just what kind of writing was it? As found in Jimenez, according to Rebecca Bells, in 2016, Native American women formed a prayer circle to try to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, and they called themselves the Water Protectors. According to Rebecca Bells, the cyclical nature of Native American history since European invasion has been the constant theft of sacred lands by European colonists and later by the U.S. government. That's been the overall pattern. Also, according to Rebecca Bells, despite the history of the U.S. military wiping out Native populations, Native Americans have a long history of serving in the U.S. military, going back to the Revolutionary War. So, though the U.S. military has been used in genocidal efforts against Native Americans also have been a major part of the U.S. military going back to the foundation of the United States as a country. Also, according to Rebecca Bells, in 1969, as part of the Red Power movement, 80 Native Americans declared Alcatraz as native lands under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. In 1973, the American Indian movement took over Wounded Knee, right? Wounded Knee is in Custer. In 1973, the American Indian movement took over the whole town, declared it their own. According to Patricia Hill Collins, also found in Jimenez, historically, Black women have felt tension and at times contradictions between racial solidarity and gender solidarity, because oftentimes gender inequality will not be addressed when discussing racial inequality, and racial inequality will oftentimes not be addressed when discussing gender inequality. And Black women live at an intersection of these two things, of being women and being Black. And so this is, again, Patricia Collins is instrumental in terms of developing the concept in the social sciences of intersectionality. She was the president in 2004 of the American Sociological Association. According to Patricia Collins, in what are the ways that Black women's bodies have been used under systems of heterosexism? So, what ways have their bodies have been exploited? And Collins cites pornography, prostitution, and racialized body aesthetics. So, for instance, holding someone at arm's length, rejecting the person, say, because of race, but co opting aspects of Black women's aesthetics, like white women getting tight weaves or cornrows in their hair, the tight braids, and everything. That would be an example of this, the racialized body aesthetics. Also, according to Patricia Collins, a social system and ideology that privileges a very specific way to be gendered and sexual that doles out advantages and disadvantages across all other social groups, and is also a racialized concept, is heterosexism. According to Augustin Palacios, legally, Mexican Americans are considered white. This comes out of the Mexican American War. It was actually because during the Mexican American War, you had to be white in the United States to own property, and Mexico negotiated for Mexicans who were going to have the border move across them because Mexico lost half its territory to the United States under the ideology of manifest destiny following the Mexican American War. And so that left a lot of people who were Mexican on the United States side of the border. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that put an end to the Mexican American War, Mexico negotiated with the United States that Mexicans would be considered white for the purposes of owning property. According to Augustin Palacios, beginning in 1910, Mexicans in Hollywood were always cast as the bad guys, the villains. According to Augustin Palacio, what race are Mexicans? And it's not as simple as white. Now, legally speaking, in terms of legal constructionism, it would be white because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But in terms of actual lived experience Many people who have Mexican ancestry, Mexican heritage, um, actually face a much more complex and ambiguous racial landscape. So, because of the complex and ambiguous history of racializing Mexicans, Mexican is an ethnicity that has been treated in the US like a race, and it thus functions like a race, but it's not technically a race. It's technically an ethnicity. Um, and so, in this sense, Mexican is actually a great example of ambiguity in turn, and uh, the modern concept of race is constructed simply doesn't work. Now, according to Wendy No, the first ethnic group, and this is also in Jimenez, that Americans wrote a law to ban was the Chinese. The first ethnic group that Americans wrote a law specifically to ban were Chinese. Uh, Also, according to When You Know, stereotypes coming from the model minority myth led to anti Asian violence as other Americans who are out of work blame Asians due to the model minority myth. And so the model minority myth is a racialized stereotype that people from the continent of Asia um, are all hyper intelligent in terms of computer sciences and mathematics, and they all know martial arts. And I mean, these are all stereotypes. And so they're smart, studious, and hardworking. And then, well, if that's how you're constructed, and then there's a slump in the jobs market, then the other groups who are not a part of Asian groups will look at Asian groups and say, they're taking our jobs. Look at that. So, there's really no such thing as a positive stereotype, even if the stereotype on the surface seems positive. According to Wendy No, Asia is a big continent and with many different cultures, and many different histories. But different Asian groups in the U.S. face very different realities depending on which Asian group that they are perceived to belong to, along lines of economics, education, violence targeted at them, and ethnic status. And so Asia is highly diverse, and the experience of Asian immigrants in America and Asian Americans in America is highly diverse as well. Also in Jimenez, according to Rudy P. Guevara Jr., migrant agricultural labor in California has historically and currently been Mexicans and Filipinos, Filipinas. According to Rudy P. Guevara Jr., San Diego is the city that he emphasizes as his main example. Also, Guevara, the U.S. Uh, creates contradictory situations regarding immigrant labor, such as creating programs to increase immigrant labor, then passing laws to criminalize and deport immigrant labor, all while maintaining a high demand economically for immigrant labor. And so there are all these contradictions that go into these kinds of things. All right. Now, turning our attention to Rita Stephen, also in Jimenez. While legally in the US, people from the Middle East are considered white, they have been treated as a racialized other throughout the US's history and still currently. So, in terms of legal construction, people from the Middle East are considered white. However, that's not how they've been treated historically or today. Also, according to Rita Stevens, the Check It Right, You Ain't White campaign was about getting separate category for Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, on the census as a separate racial category. Also, according to Rita Stephen, the MENA community demonstrates changing racial social realities when considering that historically MENA group members had to argue to be white in order to get rights, but now have to fight to be distinguished from whites because they are distinct from European Americans and face different social realities, especially after the increase in Islamophobia following 9/11 2001. Now let's turn our attention to Paul Ortiz. According to Paul Ortiz, the fight to get New Deal policies to cover occupations with high representation of Black and Latinx workers was the 1933 bagging strike. 1933 bagging strike. According to Paul Ortiz, when the Depression first began in 1929, President Herbert Hoover continued an American political tradition we still see today of scapegoating Mexicans. Yep, when the stock market crashed, Herbert Hoover blamed Mexicans for it. According to Paul Ortiz, just to be clear, that was absurd. Okay. According to Paul Ortiz, which of the following was one of the four types of workers left out of the New Deal? I'm looking for domestic workers there. And so you see the higher concentration of minorities, racial minorities, and ethnic minorities in domestic work. And so while the New Deal was worded carefully so as to not have necessarily overt racialized language, but to make sure that most of the benefits were going to be going to European Americans specifically. According to Paul Ortiz, which of the following groups was part of the civil rights movement of the 1950s to 1970s? Well, there was the Poor People's Campaign, the Memphis Sanitation Workers Union, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. There were many. Go and take a look at that part of the readings. According to Paul Ortiz, while Chapultepec pointed in the direction of greater equality between all people, the U.S. decided to follow interventionist imperialistic policies in Latin America, justified by the new conceptualization of the Monroe Doctrine and in the name of national security. And so this was we were going through in the U.S. has been heavily involved in Latin American politics, and it's one of the reasons why, politically speaking, there are some of the most unstable countries in the world in Central and South America. And we will oftentimes support pro-American insurgents in Latin America over democratically elected governments, causing widespread disruption. All right. According to Paul Ortiz, a big motivator for the farm workers movement was the ending of the Bracero program in 1964. All right. So those are the main things you want to focus on for the exam. I wish you all well, and I will talk with you again soon.